into the book of Colossians, and we're looking at family matters, and we're looking at the different roles that people in the family play. And of course, we've talked about husbands and wives extensively now. Last week, of course, we had the missionary in, so but I dealt with men both as husbands and fathers. And we got to remember that we are dealing with a very harsh world in the Roman Greek world at this time, where the men pretty well dominated. Women were much more like a tool. They were, if you were the wife, then it just made everything legal as far as offspring and so forth. But you also had access to all kinds of sins at the temple. You could have immorality on retainer. You could have slaves, and we know whenever you bring slaves into a situation, and we talked about that, how that it just breeds even more corruption and immorality and decadence. And yet in this, we see that there are several things that we see that God changed subtly. He didn't come out with slavery. We'll talk about that later. He did mention bond service, and he talked about masters over them. So he wasn't overtly trying to change slavery as they knew it, but just by the love of God and by the very fact, and we see this all through slavery, and especially the dichotomy of thinking, and even in the making of our country, where I still remember that one of the most famous cartoons that the British put out was whenever they were reading it, of course, in their newspapers. They had somebody reading the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, but they had a little black slave, holding the umbrella over the person reading it. So they were, letting us know that sometimes we're so blind. I mean, all of us have blind spots, and that was a huge blind spot, and we have them in our lives today. People that talk about children are destroying children. People that are wanting to that talk about the Me Too movement, turn around and then promote the mutilation of children. And so all the different things that we see that man is always contradicting. We've always got blind spots. We've always got something to work on. But now, in changing the family and changing even the household with even the slaves there, we see that it was going to change the culture from inside out. And so we see that as a man was not to be to use his wife, but she's on equal par with him, or on par with him, as far as equality with God, access to the throne of God, that he was to love her, and as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And so that meant that he can't just treat her harshly, God, and be godly at the same time. And so we see that there was a breaking there. Then we saw that the man is the ruler of the house, that he was not to provoke his children to anger. And we saw that both in Ephesians and in Colossians, where a man just wasn't say, might makes right, and do as I say and not as I do. But we see that, and we trace that, and they were to teach the children love. And that's how do you teach love outside of showing it? Love is a work. Love is an initiative. And we saw that. And we talked about the fruit of the Spirit is love. And it brings joy and peace. And then it works through that to the long-suffering and things. We saw how that the fruit of the Spirit there is also a definition of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And so we saw that. But now, so we're going to back up, and I skipped over children. But those children, we talk about in Colossians chapter 3, verse 20. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. So we see that right off the bat that the family unit is the most important unit in society. And so we see that as a church, the church supports the family, and the strong families support the church. That's the way God has designed. And so we see that as an example, fathers are to set the example by love to their families. But the men of the church also are to teach the example of love by how they treat their wife and their children. And also, we got to remember, we're going to see this in a moment, that it's generational. And how that you treat your parents is going to be a good indication of teaching your children how to treat you as they get older. And so if we turn back and we're going to look at a couple of other passages now, we see that he says it's well-pleasing then for children to obey their parents. Of course, we want them to be godly parents so that they could obey godly rules or godly matters. And so turn back to chapter 5 of Ephesians, and we see that as the Lord is talking, well, actually chapter 6 says, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. So there's the qualification. If your parents tells you to go out and kill somebody, that's not what to do. As teenagers and children that grew up, there's always that wisdom that they must have if they have ungodly parents, is they come to church and they learn all these things. Well, they still want to be obedient to parents unless their parents tell them to go out and do something that's ungodly, like I want you to rob a bank, or I don't want to put anything. I don't want to get into too many hypotheticals, but the obvious ones. But there's always that difficulty. Well, my mother wants me to wear these indecent clothes. I've had that happen. Where the girl is learning convictions about modesty, and her mother. It's sad to see that's what's out there today as far as parents teaching their children. And so it's very difficult, but there's no difference because there were mothers who grew up and they had seen all kinds of things in Ephesians or in Ephesus and in Colossae as far as the way women were treated and the way that women could make money by different things. And so it would be very difficult for a young girl to come to church with a godly family and learn all these things and then go home to a family that is just totally ungodly with all the different things that are going on. I came from an unsaved family, so I know a little bit about that. Not totally. My family was not harsh, or my dad and mom never taught me to go out and rob a bank, or I can't think of anything that would have been bad that my parents taught me. But I have met kids that have, and it's just amazing. My dad he takes me to the bar and he wants me to drink beer with her. How old are you? 14. I've had that, I go down to, and they'll tell me things that they're doing with their parents. Or, well, I don't want to get too deep because I might betray a confidence. So, we're on the air. And when I say that, people say, "Oh, I know a little bit about." No, I try to keep it so that the people are either dead or long gone or whatever. But here we see that. So children, obey your parents, for this is right. In the Lord, for this is right. So I'm not telling, and one of the things I'm not telling a child to rebel against their parents. I'm saying this is where we must really pray and ask for wisdom. Much like Daniel had to pray for wisdom when he got onto the king's court, or Joseph. You can imagine all the things that they had to put up with in those foreign places. And so children, obey your parents. And so the concept and the principle then is, first of all, as I said, it all begins with the father. It all begins with the man. Teaching love by the way you love your wife, the way you love your family. And of course, that gives the family something to respond to. And, so it's not might makes right, but how do you convey that love? Be not bitter against your child. Well, what does that mean? That means you're long-suffering. That means you're kind. That means you are teaching them the things of God when you wake up, when you go to bed. That means companionship. That means that you're taking them with you. That's one of the things I tried to do with my children. It was to take them with me to different things, especially in the ministry. I'd seen too many pastors that their children had fallen by the wayside or were rebels. I think of a man right now who's very prominent in Christian circles. I've read several of his books. And yet he's got a boy now that has grown up, and he's one of the leading atheist influencers on the internet. So he's anti-church, anti-everything. And I feel for that man. And then again, and our children fall. And so I am not one. I think of one man whose son committed suicide. And I said, well, and just in the thing that flashed through my mind was about that man's son. He said, well, look, he's kind of gone off into liberalism and all that kind of stuff. So, but then just a great man that I know that has lived for the Lord till the day he died, and yet his son committed suicide. So we don't have all the answers, folks. And so whenever we see someone fall into sin, oh, it's their parents. No, children are children. And we must raise them the best way, or we want to raise them up, realizing that we depend on God for everything. And so let's turn back then, and we talked about society has shown that the stability of the home, and let's turn back to Exodus chapter 20. We're going to turn back where, did we read the Ephesians? Okay, for this is the first commandment with promise. Okay, we didn't read that. Okay, I looked at it. So let's turn back to Ephesians and pick that up again. Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. I got ahead of myself because that's what the principle I was talking about. Honor your father and your mother. Now, that is ageless. That means that I, as a man, must honor my mother and my father. And the one thing that I had to learn, because as I've said several times, my father and I didn't get along very well growing up. And even as adults, I tried. It was one of those things where one time I just realized one time I had to call him up, and we talked quite a while. I just told him, I really have been bitter toward you. And we talked it out. But I realized, and this happened shortly before I got married, but I realized that if I take that bitterness into my marriage, it was going to affect my home. And what got me going on that was a story I read one time about a man who came home and he saw his daughter and his son playing house, as far as, and the boy, he was a preacher, so the boy was up preaching, and then they come down and all this kind of stuff. And he saw the daughter with the dolls and everything, but then he saw a couple of old raggedy dolls off to the side. And they were just kind of thrown off to the side. And they would, every once in a while, yell at him or whatever. And he said, well, you're treating you're cuddling the baby, but why are you yelling at those two people, those two dolls over there? Oh, that's Grandma and Grandpa. And he realized that he was treating his grandparents or his parents like that. And he was teaching his children how to honor or dishonor his mother and father. And boy, when I read that scared me. And so I said, I've got to make sure that I don't do that. And my father, even after after my kids started growing up, I always wanted them to, they never knew a lot of the things that I was bitter about and concerned about. And I tried to keep it that way, and I tried to honor my father. Even with that, there were a couple of times my father lost his temper with me, and just really said some mean and cruel things. But then later on I found out that he was having some heart problems and sugar diabetes problems, and so he was having all those things that were going. So he was he's always had a hot temper. But he never learned to control it, and he could really say some cutting things. But when my kids now were up and almost teenagers, one of those flashpoints hit. And my dad would have been in his 80, well, just about in his late 70s by this time. And he could, and it was one of those things where he hung up on me, and I, but the first time in my life, and now I'm already in my 40s, the first time in my life, my dad called me and apologized. It's one of those things. But, God was working on him. And when my dad died, he was a member of a good church, and the pastor was telling us all the things he was doing, and some of the things. My dad had a sense of humor, kind of a corny. Well, I didn't get that from. No, well, my wife says I have a corny, but and what gets me is when my kids will call up and they'll say, "Oh no!" And I say, "What's that?" "I'm becoming like my dad." I'm going, "Oh brother," So if they're going to become like me, I hope that they never saw some of that conflict between my father and me. Now my children have conflicts, and I mean, we are not perfect. I don't know why they don't see me as a perfect man who can just take all my advice. In fact, now as my children are raising children, I have to bite my tongue like crazy. Anybody else have to do that? I mean, or anybody have to, so there again is I've got to let them make the same mistakes or whatever mistakes that I made, or they do things differently. They have a little bit different philosophy. But in the end, I want it to be that I have at least taught them to honor. Now, my mother was dead, passed away when I was before I was married, so my children never met her. But now let's just look at what the Lord says about that commandment with promise. As you turn back to Exodus chapter 20, and the Lord said, and God spoke these words. He said, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments." So notice how that my sins affect my children. And that it goes on, but notice it doesn't need to. I can stop that syndrome by the grace of God working in my life in changing me and my children seeing it. They see if I'm worshiping false gods. One of the major reasons that, and it's been the study or things that, and maybe I need to document some of this so that, and give you some other things to read. But some of the readings that I've done is one of the girls get their tastes as far as even the way that they want to look from their dads. Because their dad, all of a sudden his eyes brighten up whenever the starlets come on television. Or, they are the ones who raised up the Playboy models or the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. And they have all those things laying around or whatever. And so the little girl's growing up and saying, "I want to be like that." And not even realizing, and that has nothing to do with, any of the relationship between a man and a woman. I'm not saying that a man is, child molesting or anything like that, because but the kids are just learning. They learn. That's why the Bible tells us he says back in Deuteronomy chapter 8, when you lay down, when you rise up, when you sit at the table, you're always teaching your kids something. And so it's not that you're taking chapter and verse, but you realize that you're molding a person. And you're giving them a lot of your taste and everything. So when my kids say, "Oh no, I'm becoming like my dad," I'm going, "Oh boy." But I just hope they're saying that good. They say that in front of me because they want to needle me. But I'm glad that they want to do it. I'm glad we have that type of relationship. And so we see that visiting the iniquity. Iniquity is what? Remember what we said? Transgressions are actions. Iniquity is twisted thinking. So we teach our kids how to think, or some of their tastes. Whether it's food or whatever else, the culture, everything. We're teaching our kids so many things and not even knowing it. So we want to make sure that the iniquity of our fathers is being straightened out in our lives, and then that we're not passing it on down to the next generation. And so notice he's talking about the children here, even in the 10 Commandments. Before the first 4 commandments deal with our relationship to God. The last 6 deal with our social relationships with one another. And so even in our relationship to God, we're teaching our children something by the way that we respond. So, and he says, even to the 3rd and 4th generations, my grandchildren are learning things. And the one thing, I'll talk to one of my teenage granddaughters and I'll say some corny joke and she says, you're just like my dad. And I go, oh boy, no, he's just like me. But and so you're just as corny as he is and all this kind of stuff. Well, I love that. I wish I could be around her a little more, but there again, I realize that I pass things out, and now my grandchildren are saying things that come back to haunt me at times. And so that's the way God made it. The family unit, and it begins with the godly man, is so important because we've got to teach love. We've got to teach the love of God. Our children learn it by almost like osmosis, more than you will learn this, you will go to Sunday school. No, if you'll notice in the Old Testament, the children, whenever they would have these big congregations, the Bible repeatedly would say Moses and the people and the children were there to listen to the instruction of Moses. And so what I've tried to do in church, in my ministry, is we know that kids come in untrained. And if you're going to get anything out of the message, then you've got to, the children. I taught school as a substitute in a public school for about a year. And kids in that school, I don't know if it's like that here, but they just would get up and roam around. They were not taught to sit in their seat for any period of time. Whatever they wanted to do, they were just roaming. And I'm going, how do you learn anything? And how do you even teach anything with a room like that? Was that like that in anything that you did in your class lately? Or, okay, not really. Okay, I won't go too far in that. She's now a college kid, so we won't get into that. But yeah, it's interesting the different ways things happen. But so, when kids come here, I'm not surprised if they get up and roam around because they haven't been taught. And so what we try to do is if they're going to roam around, let's have it during the before the offering, and then we have the junior church. But I want them to at least learn to experience something. I don't want a church, if we grow to 1,000, I don't want a church where, and I had a lady call me this past week, and she said, do you have this program this month? I said, no, we don't. And I've learned not to say, oh, no, no, I don't try to sell them, because I already know what they're doing. But she was looking for a church where if she came at all, if she didn't just drop them off at the church, if she came at all, she wanted to let them go and meet them back at the car. And I don't know about her husband or anything like that, but I've talked to men like that. Do you have this and this and this? No, the greatest teacher that your children are going to have is not the youth pastor. In fact, I am adamantly opposed to youth pastors taking over the spiritual lead of children and of teenagers. It's the father. Now, I don't mind the assistant, and there again, we want to teach children of all ages by any way that we can to live for the Lord. And yes, we can have specialties as far as different groups, but the whole graded education system is something that's only come in within the last couple of hundred years. I mean, people, and even in the Catholic churches today, The children still go to church with their parents. I mean, and Catholic children they learn so much better about how to at least sit still than Baptist children do. And that's one of the things that really bothers me, but how do we do that? How do we teach this? But notice that the learning comes through the family. And notice he's talking even here, for I, the Lord am God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers. There it goes again. Did he say anything about the mothers? It's interesting, again, I've been studying this and looking at this. The thing just and I've had several reactions to this now, but it never tells a woman to directly love her. Now, there again, there is the love there and so forth. And it never tells a woman to love the children. It's innate within them. Now, there are places in Peter where it says, teach the women to love their wives, to be keepers of a home, and to love their children. So even with that is teaching, Now, there again, so it all begins with the man. It begins with God dealing with the man. Now, that doesn't mean that a woman who's godly, and unfortunately this is what happens in our culture and all cultures, religion is for women and children. No, that is heresy. It takes a man to be a Christian. It takes a man to be a godly husband. It takes a man to be a godly father. It all begins with the men. Now, here I'm talking to a lot of ladies here, but again, even with her, and that's one thing I liked about Elizabeth Elliot. She was a missionary whose husband was killed, but she. One of the things she did later in her life as a retired lady, great teacher. I'd like to listen to her. She was very profoundly deep. And of course, but she would teach and teach in such a way that she was not offending men. That's one reason. That's the reason I can't listen to somebody like Joyce Meyer, because she's the fullback on the football team that just mows over men, and she's mowed over about 3 or 4 guys that she's married or whatever. I don't know, but Elizabeth Elliot was a very godly woman, and she wrote a book about and I need to get it. I don't forget I've got it in my library, but talking to one of her teenage grandsons about how to become a man, and that's one of the best books for children or for young men that I've ever read. It comes from a mother. But there again, teaching a man to be a man, so her husband was dead, and so here she's got to teach her own kid. The man I was just talking about, Morris Gleiser, he and I have been knowing each other all our adults. I met him in college. I went to listen to him preach over in Pecatonica this past week. But he's got a tremendous testimony, because when he was about 10 or 11, his father was killed. But he was a very godly man. And his mother raised him around in a church with a bunch of godly men. And he is one of the best preachers I've ever heard. I mean, when I say that, I really get a lot out of him, because I know what the church can do. His father got saved and started raising his kids. Well, he got killed. Well, by this time, his kids had a foundation, because his mother, and she took them to church, and they learned around godly people how to be a godly man. So the church is vital. And that's the reason Lord, I'm praying right now. I'm praying for 3 new men in their 30s and 40s that I want to, just 3. I mean, Lord, give me 3 that can, that I can teach to be men, and to teach how to teach men, because it all begins there. And so we see that you're to teach your children the iniquity of the fathers. Now, of course, we know the iniquity of the mothers, but because this is generic in the sense that it begins with the man. And so we see that children, the 3rd and 4th generations of things who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. So I sure am glad God's had mercy on me. Amen. So I'm glad that my kids have seen God's mercy on me. And have they seen God's beating? Have they seen God's chastening of me? Oh boy, have they. And there again, will I take it? there again, whom the Lord loves, he chastens. And then in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24, it says, if you don't chasten your children, then you hate them. Now, the word hate there in the Bible we know means love less, or it's that you don't genuinely love them unless you're willing to correct them. But we've talked about that before, about what is true correction. Correction can be very positive. We've got to make sure that we encourage them. We don't discourage them. But we also teach a standard that you can't have the fling without the sting. So there is that good old healthy respect. I respect the policemen that come by here. And one of the things that we see, these teenage boys, they want to sass a policeman at 9 o'clock at night with a guy shining his flashlight in your car. And I've told my kids over and over again, you don't mess with the man with a badge and a gun. And even if you disagree with him, you let him have his way. If he wants to take you to the police, don't fight him, because you're going to lose. Now, the policemen I've met around here, they've been as pleasant and been as nice to me as anybody. In fact, they come and you're the pastor, and they try to help me. They let me know that anything I need. But at the same time, if I see that little blue light behind me, I know I got problems. Right? And so that's the idea of even a father. I want my kids to know I'll die for them. But they also need to know that when they were growing up, at least, that there's certain limits and there are certain penalties when there's rebellion. Now, and so we see that this is what the Bible is teaching here. So he goes on in verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So, boy, that's the thing that gets me today, is we were, just to hear kids using 4-letter words around their parents. Where are they learning that? From their parents. And so we see, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes the Lord's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath, and we can talk about that. But notice in verse 12 then, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. There's the first commandment with promise. Notice it begins with the man loving the Lord and not putting any false gods before him. But then notice to honor the father. Notice the father is to teach their children, but then the child is to honor the father, and notice the reward. Now the term long upon the land, you've got to remember that the Lord is talking, the land was so important to the Jew. Of course, that was their inheritance. And then the word long there can carry, it's a word that can mean two things. It can mean either length or it can mean quality. In other words, length of days is good days, long days of happiness. A good old 24-hour period of happiness with your family. And so he's talking about that your days may be long, that your days may be happy, that your days may be filled with contentment in the land. Now notice two things there. When the family is happy, the nation is happy. The people are happy. When the family is happy, the church is happy. When the family is living within the parameters of decency, the schools will be decent. And so it all begins, the basic unit of society and of America has been the family. One of the reasons that the Romans were such a strong nation was, even though they were cruel, they had a very strong unit, a family unit. Now the father again was the man, but all this corruption that came in about living and all the adultery and everything, that didn't come in until until Rome conquered Greece. And I think it was Edmund Burke, or one of them, that said that Rome conquered Greece militarily, But Greece conquered Rome socially. And really, and I won't say Edmund Burke, but it's who was the one that wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. It wasn't Burke. I'll think about it in a minute. And he credits the rise of the Roman Empire before they conquered Greece. But the seeds of corruption were sown and really started going down after they conquered Greece. So it's interesting how that's true. And what's that? Are we worried about? I mean, we've got aircraft carriers. That one aircraft carrier has more power than many of the air forces, or the majority of the air forces of all the countries in the world. Just one of our aircraft carriers. Now, of course, we know there's a lot of small countries, but we got 12 of them. We got aircraft carriers that most countries of the world can't even afford one of them. But what are we worried about today? We're not going to fall from without. We'll fall from within. And are we happy? Our cities are burning. We're a trash heap. Our schools are unhappy. Families are families. We don't have families anymore. The Supreme Court has redefined the family out of existence. It really bothers me today when all these commercials, and they'll talk about you and your partner. Oh, wait a minute. What about you and your wife or you and your spouse? But you don't hear that even in advertisements today. It's whoever the person you're living with. And that's so sad. Because, of course, that's the unit of society. And one of the major problems we have in churches today, again, is how do you form a church when you've got yours, mine, and ours, and all the rest that have no concept of what families are. I was with that group of pictures I was telling you about. But one of the big problems you're having today is whenever there's a new family coming into church, I don't even ask them if it's mother. I don't even say Mr. and Mrs. anymore. Not until I find out. Because you don't know. We've had, I think of it just popped in my mind. I haven't seen him in several years, but I need to call him. But he and a girl came in, they were wanting counseling. Well, they were living with one another. So I gave them counsel. They did split up, but it wasn't my fault. It was just they realized they had problems. But I said, it's not going to really, until both of you want to live for the Lord, and yet both of you are, there's certainly godly guidelines, and I didn't start off with that. I started off with other things. But they realized they were in sin. And so it wasn't going to work. And no matter how much they tried to patch it together, the relationship started off wrong, so it never was going to be intimate emotionally. It was going to be intimate physically, but not emotionally. And so there again, we see that this is the whole idea that honor your father and mother. I'm all over the place this morning, I guess, but sometimes I bring too much stuff into my thought life here. But there again, honor your father and mother. So that is something that even if my mother and father were living in immorality, that I still want to honor them for the sake of my kids. I don't want to be, oh, my dad, he's just, no, I don't want to hate my kid in front of my kids. I don't want to hate my father in front of my kids. Because what am I teaching my kid? To hate. So it's so important that we learn how to love. What about a church? We got people that I've met. I went to this church, and boy, I was sitting out in the foyer when, boy, they really had a fight. And they won't go to church anywhere now. Well, how sad. And there again is all I can do is show them the love of God. And I'm not going to tell them, well, you just come here and we'll all love you. No, it's just that, hey, listen, if you want to come and get things settled with let's just, I don't put it that way, just talking back and forth. Hey, you're welcome to come. And I hope you'll find that we're not like that. But and I'm sorry that the church was like that. I will apologize on behalf of the church. That should not have happened. But that's all you can do, right? But they learned that the church, they learned to hate religion through the church. Isn't that sad? And so, are they saved? I hope so. There again, I don't know. But it all begins with the family, and it all begins with the man. And then again, here I'm talking about lady, but even with that, a lady can point her husband, or excuse me, and that's one thing that Morris's mother did. She made sure he got around the right men. And that's the reason I like it that when we have young people coming, and we have a kind of a fatherly, and I promote that. Hey, listen, and especially with the young girls and all that kind of stuff. I want to make it so that hey, listen, we're here to help you, to protect you, to everything, and to make sure that it's lily pure. That's why when I talk about my men, I try to teach them exactly how to treat a woman. Because it all begins with us. But then it does, a woman can, there again, that's why the Bible, and boy, I'm going off, I'm sorry I started, I have my little outline, I got it here, but I'm all over the place this morning. I forget what I was going to say now, but this is where we want to see God work through the church. And you say, well, we don't have a whole lot of people. No, but what we have, God can use. And people need to see the love of God. And they need to see people that know how to treat one another. Men who know how to treat women. Women who know how to respond and how to love others themselves. Oh, about loving children. There again, that's the verse I was looking for. I like what someone said when it says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life, Proverbs 4. But someone, and I was listening to a man talk to us preachers. I'm always wanting to learn about how to be a man. You're 70-something, I want to be a man for the Lord. I want to be a man of God. But the preacher said something that made a lot of sense. He said, you might want to put that word wife in there. Keep thy wife with all diligence, for out of her are the issues of life. Because you're not going to be around those kids as much as she is. She issued them. They came from her body. She nurtured them. They came from her breast. She's going to be the one coddling them and all the rest. And so you keep her right, or you keep her with all your heart, and it will pass down to the kids. I wish I could have learned that a lot sooner. And now my wife thinks I'm a pretty good guy, I hope. But that's through mercy and grace. And she's had a lot of mercy and a lot of grace. But she married an old brute. But I've tried to learn. But by the time you get old enough to have learned everything, you don't have a chance to teach. You can't go back and redo it. And so that's the reason we need to teach children. Teach a boy how to be a man. I don't want to teach a boy how to be a boy. I want to teach a boy to be a man. Oh, you're 12 years old. Let's go out and have a good time. No, let's teach you. No, yeah, let's go out and have a good time, but be a man. And so, again, okay. I'm sorry. I'm all over the place. Did anybody get 3 points in a poem out of that this morning? It was a homily, I think, or whatever. But, okay. I guess we can cut off. If anybody has any questions or just a comment, we got a couple of minutes. Anybody?